Chapter 7 of The Adventures of Sally. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Sally by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 7. Some Meditations on Success. If actors and actresses are like children in that they are readily depressed by disaster, they have the child's compensating gift of being easily uplifted by good fortune. It amazed Sally that any one mortal should have been able to spread such universal happiness as she had done by the simple act of lending her brother Fillmore $20,000. If the millennium had arrived, the members of the Primrose Way Company could not have been on better terms with themselves. The lethargy and dispiritedness caused by their week of inaction fell from them like a cloak. The sudden elevation of that creature of the abyss, the assistant stage manager, to the dizzy height of proprietor of the show, appealed to their sense of drama. Most of them had played in pieces where much the same thing had happened to the persecuted heroine round about 11 o'clock, and the situation struck them as theatrically sound. Also, now that she had gone, the extent to which Miss Hobson had acted as a blight was universally recognized. A spirit of optimism reigned, and cheerful rumors became current. The bowler-hatted Teddy had it straight from the lift-boy at his hotel that the ban on the theatres was to be lifted on Tuesday at the latest, while no less an authority than the cigar-stand girl at the Pontchartrain had informed the man who played the butler that Toledo and Cleveland were opening tomorrow. It was generally felt that the sun was bursting through the clouds, and that fate would soon despair of the hopeless task of trying to keep good men down. Fillmore was himself again. We all have our particular mode of self-expression in moments of elation. Fillmore's took the shape of buying a new waistcoat and 100 half-dollar cigars, and being very fussy about what he had for lunch. It may have been an optical illusion, but he appeared to Sally to put on at least 6 pounds in weight on the first day of the new regime. As a serf looking after paper knives and other properties, he had been, for him, almost slim. As a manager he blossomed out into soft billowy curves, and when he stood on the sidewalk in front of the theatre, gloating over the new posters which bore the legend, "Fillmore Nicholas presents," the populace had to make a detour to get round him. In this era of bubbling joy it was hard that Sally, the fairy godmother responsible for it all, should not have been completely happy too, and it puzzled her why she was not. But whatever it was that cast the faint shadow refused obstinately to come out from the back of her mind and show itself and be challenged. It was not till she was out driving in a hired car with Gerald one afternoon on Belle Isle that enlightenment came. Gerald, since the departure of Miss Hobson, had been at his best. Like Fillmore, he was a man who responded to the sunshine of prosperity. His moodiness had vanished, and all his old charm had returned. And yet it seemed to Sally, as the car slid smoothly through the pleasant woods and fields by the river, that there was something that jarred. Gerald was cheerful and talkative. He, at any rate, found nothing wrong with life. He held forth spaciously on the big things he intended to do. "If this play gets over, and it's going to, I'll show 'em." His jaw was squared, and his eyes glowed as they stared into the inviting future. "One success, that's all I need, then watch me. I haven't had a chance yet, but—" His voice rolled on, but Sally had ceased to listen. It was the time of year when the chill of evening follows swiftly on the mellow warmth of afternoon. The sun had gone behind the trees, and a cold wind was blowing up from the river. And quite suddenly, as though it was the wind that had cleared her mind, she understood what it was that had been lurking at the back of her thoughts. For an instant it stood out nakedly, without concealment, and the world became a forlorn place. She had realized the fundamental difference between man's outlook on life and woman's. Success! How men worshipped it, and how little of themselves they had to spare for anything else. Ironically, it was the theme of this very play of Gerald's which she had saved from destruction. Of all the men she knew, how many had any view of life except as a race which they must strain every nerve to win, regardless of what they missed by the wayside in their haste? Fillmore, Gerald, all of them. There might be a woman in each of their lives, but she came second, an afterthought, a thing for their spare time. Gerald was everything to her. His success would never be more than a side issue as far as she was concerned. He himself, without any of the trappings of success, was enough for her. But she was not enough for him. A spasm of futile jealousy shook her. She shivered. "Cold?" said Gerald. "I'll tell the man to drive back. I don't see any reason why this play shouldn't run a year in New York. Everybody says it's good. If it does get over, they'll all be after me. Sally stared out into a bleak world. The sky was leaden grey, and the wind from the river blew with a dismal chill. End of Chapter 7. Read on August 22nd, 2008, in San Diego, California. Chapter 8 of The Adventures of Sally. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Sally by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 8. Reappearance of Mr. Carmyle and Ginger. 1. When Sally left Detroit on the following Saturday, accompanied by Fillmore, who was returning to the metropolis for a few days in order to secure offices and generally make his presence felt along Broadway, her spirits had completely recovered. She felt guiltily that she had been fanciful, even morbid. Naturally men wanted to get on in the world. It was their job. She told herself that she was bound up with Gerald's success, and that the last thing of which she ought to complain was the energy he put into efforts of which she, as well as he, would reap the reward. To this happier frame of mind the excitement of the last few days had contributed. Detroit, that city of amiable audiences, had liked The Primrose Way. The theatre, in fulfilment of Teddy's prophecy, had been allowed to open on the Tuesday, and a full house, hungry for entertainment after its enforced abstinence, had welcomed the play wholeheartedly. The papers, not always in agreement with the applause of a first-night audience, had on this occasion endorsed the verdict, with agreeable unanimity hailing Gerald as the coming author and Elsa Doland as the coming star. There had even been a brief mention of Fillmore as the coming manager. But there is always some trifle that jars in our greatest moments, and Fillmore's triumph had almost been spoilt by the fact that the only notice taken of Gladys Winch was by the critic who printed her name, spelt Wunch, in the list of those whom the cast also included. "One of the greatest character actresses on the stage," said Fillmore bitterly, talking over this outrage with Sally on the morning after the production. From this blow, however, his buoyant nature had soon enabled him to rally. Life contained so much that was bright that it would have been churlish to concentrate the attention on the one dark spot. Business had been excellent all through the week. Elsa Doland had got better at every performance. The receipt of a long and agitated telegram from Mr. Cracknell, pleading to be allowed to buy the piece back, the passage of time having apparently softened Miss Hobson, was a pleasant incident. And, best of all, the great Ike Schumann, who owned half the theatres in New York and had been in Detroit superintending one of his musical productions, had looked in one evening and stamped The Primrose Way with the seal of his approval. As Fillmore sat opposite Sally on the train, he radiated contentment and importance. "Yes, do," said Sally, breaking a long silence. Fillmore awoke from happy dreams. "Eh?" "I said, yes, do. I think you owe it to your position." "Do what?" Buy a fur coat. Wasn't that what you were meditating about?" "Don't be a chump," said Fillmore, blushing nevertheless. It was true that once or twice during the past week he had toyed negligently, as Mr. Bunbury would have said, with the notion, and why not? A fellow must keep warm. "With an astrakhan collar," insisted Sally. "As a matter of fact," said Fillmore loftily, his great soul ill-attuned to this badinage, "what I was really thinking about at the moment was something Ike said." "Ike?" "Ike Schumann. He's on the train. I met him just now." "We call him Ike?" "Of course I call him Ike," said Fillmore heatedly. "Everyone calls him Ike." "He wears a fur coat," Sally murmured. Fillmore registered annoyance. "I wish you wouldn't keep on harping on that damned coat. And anyway, why shouldn't I have a fur coat?" "Phil, how can you be so brutal as to suggest that I ever said you shouldn't? Why, I'm one of the strongest supporters of the fur coat, with big cuffs, and you must roll up Fifth Avenue in your car, and I'll point and say, 'That's my brother.' Your brother? No. He is, really. You're joking. Why, that's the great Fillmore Nicholas. I know, but he really is my brother, and I was with him when he bought that coat." "Do leave off about the coat." "And it isn't only the coat," I shall say. "It's what's underneath, tucked away inside that mass of fur, dodging about behind that dollar cigar, is one to whom we point with pride." Fillmore looked coldly at his watch. "I've got to go and see Ike Schumann." "We are in hourly consultation with Ike." "He wants to see me about the show. He suggests putting it into Chicago before opening in New York." "Oh, no!" cried Sally, dismayed. "Why not?" Sally recovered herself. Identifying Gerald so closely with his play, she had supposed for a moment that if the piece opened in Chicago, it would mean a further prolonged separation from him. But of course there would be no need, she realized, for him to stay with the company after the first day or two. "You're thinking that we ought to have a New York reputation before tackling Chicago. There's a lot to be said for that. Still, it works both ways. A Chicago run would help us in New York. Well, I'll have to think it over," said Fillmore importantly. "I'll have to think it over." He mused with drawn brows. "All wrong," said Sally. "Eh?" "Not a bit like it. The lips should be compressed, and the forefinger of the right hand laid in a careworn way against the right temple. You've a lot to learn, Phil." "Oh, stop it." "Fillmore Nicholas," said Sally, "if you knew what pain it gives me to josh my only brother, you'd be sorry for me. But you know it's for your good. Now run along and put Ike out of his misery. I know he's waiting for you with his watch out. You do think he'll come, Miss Nicholas?" were his last words to me as he stepped on the train, and oh, Phil, the yearning in his voice. "Why, of course he will, Mr. Schumann," I said. "For all his exalted position, my brother is kindliness itself. Of course he'll come." "If I could only think so," he said, with a gulp. "If I could only think so. But you know what these managers are. 1,000 calls on their time. They get brooding on their fur coats and forget everything else. 'Have no fear, Mr. Schumann,' I said. 'Fillmore Nicholas is a man of his word.'" She would have been willing, for she was a girl who never believed in sparing herself where it was a question of entertaining her nearest and dearest, to continue the dialogue, but Fillmore was already moving down the car, his rigid back a silent protest against sisterly levity. Sally watched him disappear, then picked up a magazine and began to read. She had just finished tracking a story of gripping interest through a jungle of advertisements, only to find that it was in 2 parts, of which the one she was reading was the first, when a voice spoke. "How do you do, Miss Nicholas?" Into the seat before her, recently released from the weight of the coming manager, Bruce Carmyle, of all people in the world, insinuated himself with that well-bred air of deferential restraint which never left him. 2. Sally was considerably startled. Everybody travels nowadays, of course, and there is nothing really remarkable in finding a man in America whom you had supposed to be in Europe, but nevertheless she was conscious of a dream-like sensation, as though the clock had been turned back and a chapter of her life reopened which she had thought closed forever. "Mr. Carmyle!" she cried. If Sally had been constantly in Bruce Carmyle's thoughts since they had parted on the Paris express, Mr. Carmyle had been very little in Sally's, so little indeed that she had had to search her memory for a moment before she identified him. "We're always meeting on trains, aren't we?" she went on, her composure returning. "I never expected to see you in America. I came over." Sally was tempted to reply that she gathered that, but a sudden embarrassment curbed her tongue. She had just remembered that at their last meeting she had been abominably rude to this man. She was never rude to anyone without subsequent remorse. She contented herself with a tame "Yes." "Yes," said Mr. Carmyle. "It is a good many years since I have taken a real holiday. My doctor seemed to think I was a trifle run down. It seemed a good opportunity to visit America." "Everybody," said Mr. Carmyle oracularly, endeavouring, as he had often done since his ship had left England, to persuade himself that his object in making the trip had not been merely to renew his acquaintance with Sally. "Everybody ought to visit America at least once. It is part of one's education." "And what are your impressions of our glorious country?" said Sally, rallying. Mr. Carmyle seemed glad of the opportunity of lecturing on an impersonal subject. He, too, though his face had shown no trace of it, had been embarrassed in the opening stages of the conversation. The sound of his voice restored him. "I have been visiting Chicago," he said, after a brief travelogue. "Oh." "A wonderful city." "I've never seen it. I've come from Detroit." "Yes, I heard you were in Detroit." Sally's eyes opened. "You heard I was in Detroit? Good gracious, how?" "I called at your New York address and made inquiries," said Mr. Carmyle a little awkwardly. "But how did you know where I lived?" "My cousin, Lancelot told me." Sally was silent for a moment. She had much the same feeling that comes to the man in the detective story who realizes that he is being shadowed. Even if this almost complete stranger had not actually come to America in direct pursuit of her, there was no disguising the fact that he evidently found her an object of considerable interest. It was a compliment, but Sally was not at all sure that she liked it. Bruce Carmyle meant nothing to her, and it was rather disturbing to find that she was apparently of great importance to him. She seized on the mention of Ginger as a lever for diverting the conversation from its present too intimate course. "How is Mr. Kemp?" she asked. Mr. Carmyle's dark face seemed to become a trifle darker. "We have had no news of him," he said shortly. "No news? How do you mean? You speak as though he had disappeared." "He has disappeared." "Good heavens! When?" "Shortly after I saw you last." "Disappeared?" Mr. Carmyle frowned. Sally, watching him, found her antipathy stirring again. There was something about this man which she had disliked instinctively from the first, a sort of hardness. "But where has he gone to?" "I don't know." Mr. Carmyle frowned again. The subject of Ginger was plainly a sore one. "And I don't want to know," he went on heatedly, a dull flush rising in the cheeks which Sally was sure he had to shave twice a day. "I don't care to know. The family have washed their hands of him. For the future he may look after himself as best he can. I believe he is off his head." Sally's rebellious temper was well ablaze now, but she fought it down. She would dearly have loved to give battle to Mr. Carmyle. It was odd, she felt, how she seemed to have constituted herself Ginger's champion and protector, but she perceived that, if she wished, as she did, to hear more of her red-headed friend, he must be humoured and conciliated. "But what happened? What was all the trouble about?" Mr. Carmyle's eyebrows met. "He insulted his uncle. His Uncle Donald. He insulted him grossly. The one man in the world he should have made a point of... keeping in with? Yes, his future depended upon him. "But what did he do?" cried Sally, trying hard to keep a thoroughly reprehensible joy out of her voice. "I have heard no details. My uncle is reticent as to what actually took place. He invited Lancelot to dinner to discuss his plans, and it appears that Lancelot defied him. Defied him! He was rude and insulting. My uncle refuses to have anything more to do with him. Apparently the young fool managed to win some money at the tables in Roville, and this seems to have turned his head completely. My uncle insists that he is mad. I agree with him. Since the night of that dinner nothing has been heard of Lancelot." Mr. Carmyle broke off to brood once more, and before Sally could speak the impressive bulk of Fillmore loomed up in the aisle beside them. Explanations seemed to Fillmore to be in order. He cast a questioning glance at the mysterious stranger who, in addition to being in conversation with his sister, had collared his seat. "Oh, hello, Phil," said Sally. "Fillmore, this is Mr. Carmyle. We met abroad. My brother Fillmore, Mr. Carmyle." Proper introduction having been thus effected, Fillmore approved of Mr. Carmyle. His air of being someone in particular appealed to him. "Strange, you meeting again like this," he said affably. The porter, who had been making up berths along the car, was now hovering expectantly in the offing. "You two had better go into the smoking-room," suggested Sally. "I'm going to bed." She wanted to be alone, to think. Mr. Carmyle's tale of a roused and revolting Ginger had stirred her. The two men went off to the smoking-room, and Sally found an empty seat and sat down to wait for her berth to be made up. She was aglow with a curious exhilaration. So Ginger had taken her advice. Excellent Ginger! She felt proud of him. She also had that feeling of complacency, amounting almost to sinful pride, which comes to those who give advice and find it acted upon. She had the emotions of a creator. After all, had she not created this new Ginger? It was she who had stirred him up. It was she who had unleashed him. She had changed him from a meek dependent of the family to a ravening creature who went about the place insulting uncles. It was a feat. There was no denying it. It was something attempted, something done, and by all the rules laid down by the poet it should, therefore, have earned a night's repose. Yet Sally, jolted by the train, which towards the small hours seemed to be trying out some new buck and wing steps of its own invention, slept ill, and presently, as she lay awake, there came to her bedside the spectre of doubt, gaunt and questioning. Had she, after all, wrought so well? Had she been wise in tampering with this young man's life? "What about it?" said the spectre of doubt. 3. Daylight brought no comforting answer to the question. Breakfast failed to manufacture an easy mind. Sally got off the train at the Grand Central Station in a state of remorseful concern. She declined the offer of Mr. Carmyle to drive her to the boarding-house, and started to walk there, hoping that the crisp morning air would effect a cure. She wondered now how she could ever have looked with approval on her rash act. She wondered what demon of interference and meddling had possessed her to make her blunder into people's lives, upsetting them. She wondered that she was allowed to go around loose. She was nothing more nor less than a menace to society. Here was an estimable young man, obviously the sort of young man who would always have to be assisted through life by his relatives, and she had deliberately egged him on to wreck his prospects. She blushed hotly as she remembered that mad wireless she had sent him from the boat. Miserable Ginger! She pictured him, his little stock of money gone, wandering footsore about London, seeking in vain for work, forcing himself to call on Uncle Donald, being thrown down the front steps by haughty footmen, sleeping on the embankment, gazing into the dark waters of the Thames with the stare of hopelessness, climbing to the parapet and... "Ugh!" said Sally. She had arrived at the door of the boarding-house, and Mrs. Meecher was regarding her with welcoming eyes, little knowing that to all practical intents and purposes she had slain in his prime a red-headed young man of amiable manners and, when not ill-advised by meddling, muddling females, of excellent behaviour. Mrs. Meecher was friendly and garrulous. Variety, the journal which, next to the dog Toto, was the thing she loved best in the world, had informed her on the Friday morning that Mr. Foster's play had got over big in Detroit, and that Miss Doland had made every kind of hit. It was not often that the old alumni of the boarding-house forced their way after this fashion into the Hall of Fame, and, according to Mrs. Meecher, the establishment was ringing with the news. That blue ribbon round Toto's neck was worn in honour of the triumph. There was also, though you could not see it, a chicken dinner in Toto's interior, by way of further celebration. And was it true that Mr. Fillmore had bought the piece? A great man, was Mrs. Meecher's verdict. Mr. Faucitt had always said so. "Oh, how is Mr. Faucitt?" Sally asked, reproaching herself for having allowed the pressure of other matters to drive all thoughts of her late patient from her mind. "He's gone," said Mrs. Meecher, with such relish that to Sally, in her morbid condition, the words had only one meaning. She turned white and clutched at the banisters. "Gone?" "To England," added Mrs. Meecher. Sally was vastly relieved. "Oh, I thought you meant—" "Oh, no, not that." Mrs. Meecher sighed, for she had been a little disappointed in the old gentleman, who started out as such a promising invalid, only to fall away into the dullness of robust health once more. "He's well enough. I never seen anybody better. You'd think," said Mrs. Meecher, bearing up with difficulty under her grievance, "you'd think this here new Spanish influenza was a sort of tonic or somepin', the way he looks now. Of course," she added, trying to find justification for a respected lodger, "he's had good news. His brother's dead." "What?" "Not, I don't mean that was good news, far from it, though, come to think of it, all flesh is as grass, and we all got to be prepared for something of the sort breaking loose. But it seems this here new brother of his— I didn't know he'd a brother, and I don't suppose you knew he had a brother. Men are secretive, aren't they? This brother of his has left him a parcel of money, and Mr. Faucitt he had to get on the Wednesday boat quick as he could and go right over to the other side to look after things. Wind up the estate, I believe they call it. Left in an awful hurry, he did. Sent his love to you and said he'd write. Funny him having a brother, now, wasn't it? Not," said Mrs. Meecher, at heart a reasonable woman, "that folks don't have brothers. I got two myself, one in Portland, Oregon, and the other goodness knows where he is. But what I'm trying to say—" Sally disengaged herself and went up to her room. For a brief while the excitement which comes of hearing good news about those of whom we are fond acted as a stimulant, and she felt almost cheerful. Dear old Mr. Faucitt! She was sorry for his brother, of course, though she had never had the pleasure of his acquaintance, and had only just heard that he had ever existed, but it was nice to think that her old friend's remaining years would be years of affluence. Presently, however, she found her thoughts wandering back into their melancholy groove. She threw herself wearily on the bed. She was tired after her bad night. But she could not sleep. Remorse kept her awake. Besides, she could hear Mrs. Meecher prowling disturbingly about the house, apparently in search of someone, her progress indicated by creaking boards and the strenuous yapping of Toto. Sally turned restlessly, and, having turned, remained for a long instant transfixed and rigid. She had seen something, and what she had seen was enough to surprise any girl in the privacy of her bedroom. From underneath the bed there peeped coyly forth an undeniably masculine shoe and 6 inches of a grey trouser leg. Sally bounded to the floor. She was a girl of courage, and she meant to probe this matter thoroughly. "What are you doing under my bed?" The question was a reasonable one, and evidently seemed to the intruder to deserve an answer. There was a muffled sneeze, and he began to crawl out. The shoe came first, then the legs, then a sturdy body in a dusty coat, and finally there flashed on Sally's fascinated gaze a head of so nearly the maximum redness that it could only belong to one person in the world. Ginger! Mr. Lancelot Kemp, on all fours, blinked up at her. "Oh, hullo," he said. End of chapter 8. Read on August 22nd, 2008, in San Diego, California. Chapter 9 of The Adventures of Sally. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Sally by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 9. Ginger becomes a right-hand man. It was not till she saw him actually standing there before her with his hair rumpled and a large smut on the tip of his nose that Sally really understood how profoundly troubled she had been about this young man, and how vivid had been that vision of him bobbing about on the waters of the Thames, a cold and unappreciated corpse. She was a girl of keen imagination, and she had allowed her imagination to riot unchecked. Astonishment, therefore, at the extraordinary fact of his being there was, for the moment, thrust aside by relief. Never before in her life had she experienced such an overwhelming rush of exhilaration. She flung herself into a chair and burst into a screech of laughter, which even to her own ears sounded strange. It struck Ginger as hysterical. "I say, you know," said Ginger, as the merriment showed no signs of abating. Ginger was concerned. Nasty shock for a girl, finding blighters under her bed. Sally sat up, gurgling, and wiped her eyes. "Oh, I am glad to see you," she gasped. "No, really," said Ginger, gratified. "That's fine." It occurred to him that some sort of apology would be a graceful act. "I say, you know, awfully sorry. About barging in here, I mean. Never dreamed it was your room. Unoccupied, I thought." "Don't mention it. I ought not to have disturbed you. You were having a nice sleep, of course. Do you always sleep on the floor?" "It was like this." "Of course, if you're wearing it for ornament, as a sort of beauty spot," said Sally, "all right. But in case you don't know, you've a smut on your nose." "Oh, my aunt, not really?" "Now, would I deceive you on an important point like that?" "Do you mind if I have a look in the glass?" "Certainly, if you can stand it." Ginger moved hurriedly to the dressing-table. "You're perfectly right," he announced, applying his handkerchief. "I thought I was. I'm very quick at noticing things." "My hair's a bit rumpled, too." "Very much so." "You take my advice," said Ginger earnestly, "and never lie about under beds. There's nothing in it." "That reminds me, you won't be offended if I ask you something?" "No, go ahead." "It's rather an impertinent question. You may resent it." No. "Well, then, what were you doing under my bed?" "Oh, under your bed?" "Yes, under my bed. This. It's a bed, you know. Mine. My bed. You were under it. Why? Or, putting it another way, why were you under my bed?" "I was hiding." "Playing hide and seek. That explains it." "Mrs. What's-her-name, Meacher was after me." Sally shook her head disapprovingly. "We mustn't encourage Mrs. Meacher in these childish pastimes. It unsettles her." Ginger passed an agitated hand over his forehead. "It's like this." "I hate to keep criticizing your appearance," said Sally, "and personally I like it, but when you clutched your brow just then, you put about a pound of dust on it. Your hands are probably grubby." Ginger inspected them. "They are." "Why not make a really good job of it and have a wash?" Do you mind? I'd prefer it. Thanks awfully. I mean to say, it's your basin, you know, and all that. What I mean is, seem to be making myself pretty well at home. Oh, no. Touching the matter of soap... Use mine. We Americans are famous for our hospitality. Thanks awfully. The towel is on your right. Thanks awfully. And I've a clothes brush in my bag. Thanks awfully. Splashing followed, like a sea lion taking a dip. Now then, said Sally, why were you hiding from Mrs. Meecher? A careworn, almost hunted look came into Ginger's face. I say, you know, that woman is rather by way of being one of the lads, what? Scares me. Word was brought that she was on the prowl, so it seemed to me a judicious move to take cover till she sort of blew over. If she'd found me, she'd have made me take that dog of hers for a walk. Toto? Toto. You know, said Ginger, with a strong sense of injury. No dog's got a right to be a dog like that. I don't suppose there's anyone keener on dogs than I am, but a thing like a woolly rat. He shuddered slightly. Well, one hates to be seen about with it in the public streets. Why couldn't you have refused in a firm but gentlemanly manner to take Toto out? Ah, there you rather touch the spot. You see, the matter of fact is, I'm a bit behind with the rent, and that makes it rather hard to take what you might call a firm stand. But how can you be behind with the rent? I only left here the Saturday before last, and you weren't in the place then. You can't have been here more than a week. I've been here just a week. That's the week I'm behind with. But why? You were a millionaire when I left you at Roville. Well, the fact of the matter is, I went back to the tables that night and lost a goodish bit of what I'd won, and somehow or other, when I got to America, the stuff seemed to slip away. What made you come to America at all? Said Sally, asking the question which, she felt, any sensible person would have asked at the opening of the conversation. One of his familiar blushes raced over Ginger's face. Oh, I thought I would. Land of opportunity, you know. Have you managed to find any of the opportunities yet? Well, I have got a job of sorts. I'm a waiter at a rummy little place on 2nd Avenue. The salary isn't big, but I'd have wangled enough out of it to pay last week's rent, only they docked me a goodish bit for breaking plates and what not. The fact is, I'm making rather a hash of it. Oh, Ginger, you oughtn't to be a waiter. That's what the boss seems to think. I mean, you ought to be doing something ever so much better. But what? You've no notion how well all these blighters here seem to be able to get along without my help. I've tramped all over the place, offering my services, but they all say they'll try to carry on as they are. Sally reflected. I know. What? I'll make Fillmore give you a job. I wonder I didn't think of it before. Fillmore? My brother. Yes, he'll be able to use you. What as? Sally considered. As his right-hand man. Does he want a right-hand man? Sure to. He's a young fellow trying to get along. Sure to want a right-hand man. Yes, said Ginger reflectively. Of course, I've never been a right-hand man, you know. Oh, you'd pick it up. I'll take you round to him now. He's staying at the Astor. There's just one thing, said Ginger. What's that? I might make a hash of it. Heavens, Ginger, there must be something in this world that you wouldn't make a hash of. Don't stand arguing any longer. Are you dry? And clean? Very well, then, let's be off. Right-ho. Ginger took a step towards the door, then paused, rigid, with one leg in the air, as though some spell had been cast upon him. From the passage outside there had sounded a shrill yapping. Ginger looked at Sally, then he looked longingly at the bed. "Don't be such a coward," said Sally severely. "Yes, but..." How much do you owe Mrs. Meecher?" "Round about $12, I think it is." "I'll pay her." Ginger flushed awkwardly. "No, I'm hanged if you will. I mean," he stammered, "it's frightfully good of you and all that, and I can't tell you how grateful I am, but honestly, I couldn't." Sally did not press the point. She liked him the better for a rugged independence, which, in the days of his impecuniousness, her brother Fillmore had never dreamed of exhibiting. "Very well," she said. "Have it your own way. Proud. That's me all over, Mabel. Ginger!" She broke off sharply. "Pull yourself together. Where is your manly spirit? I'd be ashamed to be such a coward." "Awfully sorry, but honestly, that woolly dog..." "Never mind the dog. I'll see you through." They came out into the passage almost on top of Toto, who was stalking phantom rats. Mrs. Meecher was manoeuvring in the background. Her face lit up grimly at the sight of Ginger. "Mr. Kemp, I been looking for you." Sally intervened brightly. "Oh, Mrs. Meecher," she said, shepherding her young charge through the danger zone. "I was so surprised to meet Mr. Kemp here. He is a great friend of mine. We met in France. We're going off now to have a long talk about old times, and then I'm taking him to see my brother." "Toto..." "Dear little thing, you ought to take him for a walk," said Sally. "It's a lovely day. Mr. Kemp was saying just now that he would have liked to take him, but we're rather in a hurry, and shall probably have to get into a taxi. You've no idea how busy my brother is just now. If we're late, he'll never forgive us." She passed on down the stairs, leaving Mrs. Meecher dissatisfied but irresolute. There was something about Sally which even in her pre-wealthy days had always baffled Mrs. Meecher and cramped her style, and now that she was rich and independent, she inspired in the chatelaine of the boarding-house an emotion which was almost awe. The front door had closed before Mrs. Meecher had collected her faculties, and Ginger, pausing on the sidewalk, drew a long breath. "You know, you're wonderful," he said, regarding Sally with unconcealed admiration. She accepted the compliment composedly. "Now we'll go and hunt up Fillmore," she said. "But there's no need to hurry, of course, really. We'll go for a walk first, and then call at the Astor and make him give us lunch. I want to hear all about you. I've heard something already. I met your cousin, Mr. Carmyle. He was on the train coming from Detroit. Did you know that he was in America?" "No, I've rather lost touch with the family." "So I gathered from Mr. Carmyle. And I feel hideously responsible. It was all through me that all this happened." "Oh, no." "Of course it was. I made you what you are today. I hope I'm satisfied. I dragged and dragged you down until the soul within you died, so to speak. I know perfectly well that you wouldn't have dreamed of savaging the family as you seem to have done if it hadn't been for what I said to you at Roville. Ginger, tell me, what did happen? I'm dying to know. Mr. Carmyle said you insulted your uncle." "Donald. Yes, we did have a bit of a scrap, as a matter of fact. He made me go out to dinner with him, and we sort of disagreed. To start with, he wanted me to apologize to old Scrymgeour, and I rather gave it a miss." "Noble fellow." "Scrymgeour?" "No, silly, you." "Oh, ah." Ginger blushed. "And then there was all that about the soup, you know." "How do you mean, all that about the soup? What about the soup? What soup?" "Well, things sort of hotted up a bit when the soup arrived." "I don't understand." "I mean, the trouble seemed to start, as it were, when the waiter had finished ladling out the mulligatawny. Thick soup, you know." "I know mulligatawny is a thick soup. Yes?" "Well, my old uncle... I'm not blaming him, don't you know. More his misfortune than his fault. I can see that now. But he's got a heavy mustache, like a walrus, rather, and he's a bit apt to inhale the stuff through it. And I asked him not to. It was just a suggestion, you know. He cut up fairly rough, and by the time the fish came round, we were more or less down on the mat, chewing holes in one another. My fault, probably. I wasn't feeling particularly well disposed towards the family that night. I'd just had a talk with Bruce, my cousin, you know, in Piccadilly, and that had rather got the wind up me. Bruce always seems to get on my nerves a bit somehow, and Uncle Donald asking me to dinner and all that. By the way, did you get the books?" "What books?" "Bruce said he wanted to lend you some books. That's why I gave him your address." Sally stared. "He never sent me any books." "Well, he said he was going to, and I had to tell him where to send them." Sally walked on, a little thoughtfully. She was not a vain girl, but it was impossible not to perceive in the light of this fresh evidence that Mr. Carmyle had made a journey of 3,000 miles with the sole object of renewing his acquaintance with her. It did not matter, of course, but it was vaguely disturbing. No girl cares to be dogged by a man she rather dislikes. "Go on telling me about your uncle," she said. "Well, there's not much more to tell. I'd happened to get that wireless of yours just before I started out to dinner with him, and I was more or less feeling that I wasn't going to stand any rot from the family. I'd got to the fish course, hadn't I? Well, we managed to get through that somehow, but we didn't survive the filet steak. One thing seemed to lead to another, and the show sort of bust up. He called me a good many things, and I got a bit fed up, and finally I told him I hadn't any more use for the family and was going to start out on my own, and, well, I did, don't you know, and here I am." Sally listened to this saga breathlessly. More than ever did she feel responsible for her young protégé, and any faint qualms which she had entertained as to the wisdom of transferring practically the whole of her patrimony to the care of so erratic a financier as her brother vanished. It was her plain duty to see that Ginger was started well in the race of life, and Fillmore was going to come in uncommonly handy. "We'll go to the Astor now," she said, "and I'll introduce you to Fillmore. He's a theatrical manager, and he's sure to have something for you." "It's awfully good of you to bother about me." "Ginger," said Sally, "I regard you as a grandson. Hail that cab, will you?" End of Chapter 9. Recorded on September 1st, 2008, in San Diego, California.